You read the title of this video correctly. I read Ryoshu's source material, Hellscreen, among all the other books by its author, and I know exactly how Canto 9 is gonna play out. Probably. As the only known Project Moon fan that can read, and having done an analysis of Honlu's source material, The Rebuilt Red Chambers before, I knew I had to take up the mantle yet again as the only person in this whole community that actually reads to tell you the story of the source material and how it translates into Limbus Company. Once again, much like my previous literary analysis video, this video will contain heavy spoilers for the entire source material. However, you shouldn't click on this video because of that, because I have divided this video into two parts. The first one talking about the source material, and the second one talking about theories for Canto 9 that lightly touches upon the source material but doesn't spoil everything about it. Though I would recommend watching the section that talks about the source material anyway, as a lot of what is discussed in there builds upon my theories for the theory section. But if you want to not get spoiled for the book or simply wish to hear my theories immediately, please skip to this timestamp right here. But of course, it'll be better for YouTube statistics if you stick around for the book summary. After all, I read almost every single book by Hellscreen's author and it took a little over a month. So I'd really appreciate it if you stuck around for it. Thank you. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to the actual book summary. Ryoshu, or as some of you know her, Yoshihide, in the book is described to be one of the greatest but also cruelest painters in all of Japan. In all of the land there's none who could paint landscapes, portraits, or even suffering as great as he can. And yes, Yoshihide is a guy in the book. And just so you know, I'll be referring to Ryoshu as Yoshihide and will be using male pronouns. Sorry to then name you all that Ryoshu, but it's for the sake of the video. Anyway, Yoshihide also has a daughter, who is quite a contrast to the person Yoshihide is. Where Yoshihide were to be described as cruel, senile, and barbaric, his daughter would be described as kind, caring, and gentle. It is not said when exactly, but the girl lost her mother at a very young age, and supposedly was brought into the Horikawa manor shortly after as a lady in waiting to Lord Horikawa's own daughter. And very early on into the book we are told how much Yoshihide despises his daughter being in the position she is now. As the person telling the story, who is also a character in the book and is one of Horikawa's servants, tells us that upon finishing great artwork that Lord Horikawa was very pleased with, told Yoshihide that he could have anything he wants, to which Yoshihide immediately responded with GTFO, or in other words to give the family over and his daughter to be released from the Horikawa manor, which, well, obviously wasn't granted, otherwise the entire book would end right there. Another rather important character in the book is Lord Horikawa himself, obviously. He is the lord that resides over the Horikawa manor and is the one providing shelter to Yoshihide's daughter. And then we also have Yoshihide 2. Yeah, it turns out that there are two Yoshihides in the book. He was such a great character that they had to make a sequel to him in the same book. This Yoshihide, however, is a monkey that just so happens to be named Yoshihide. A pet in the Horikawa mansion that also happens to be very protective of human Yoshihide's daughter as she keeps it around like a loyal pet. He happens to be named as such because Yoshihide's own reputation preceded him, and the servants in the manor have resorted to insulting him, calling him Monkeyhide in reference to how barbaric of a guy he happens to be. And then in a twist of irony, naming the new pet monkey Yoshihide. Personally, however, I like to refer to Yoshihide as Freakyhide, because oh man, this guy is incredibly freaky in the book. For example, in chapter 8 of the book, an apprentice of Yoshihide mistakes the Hellscreen painting that Yoshihide is working on at the time to be haunted, claiming to hear voices coming from the painting, but turns out it's actually just Yoshihide talking in his sleep. And in another showcase of Freakyhide's freakiness, in chapter 9 of the book, another apprentice, I kid you not, was asked to be chained up by Yoshihide for the sake of the painting. The apprentice could only move his head as basically his entire body was restricted. The painting, however, was interrupted by a snake suddenly appearing from the corner of the room, which had to be taken care of by Yoshihide as he grabbed it by the tail and told it to LMFAO. Which is to say, Yoshihide said to, "Let me form art, oaf," and simply flung it into a jar in the corner of the room. To which the narrator explains that it must be a random thing Yoshihide kept in this room for God knows what reason, and that whatever Yoshihide tends to keep in his art studio sometimes is a very big mystery. As in chapter 10, another one of Freakyhide's antics occurs, as in this canto of the story, another apprentice, this time a small young boy, enters Yoshihide's chamber and sees Yoshihide and a tamed bird in the room. The boy asks what kind of bird it is, to which Yoshihide tells the boy that it's a horned owl, explaining how you don't usually find these birds so tame in the wild as they're rather aggressive, as he proceeds to give the kid a very hands-on experience by having the owl attack the kid. And while this kid is screaming and flaying around the room for help, all that Yoshihide does is to get out a piece of paper to which to draw the kid's torment with. And now, you might be asking yourself, why does Yoshihide do any of this? Like, Could a man be so cruel to do all of these things and probably more, which the book never elaborates on, but highly implies happens? Well, I'm gonna skip a little bit ahead of time to reveal that in chapter 14, it is unveiled that the reason Yoshihide is such an incredibly good painter and his art is so well regarded despite his reputation is because Yoshihide can only draw what he has seen, but what he has seen he can depict with incredibly vivid and extreme detail. Now keep this one particular detail in mind because this will be really important in the theory section. From this point in the book, we start to focus a bit more on Yoshihide's daughter, and truthfully, we don't actually get that much insight on daughter Hide, or Suzuki as some like to call her according to one version of the book. This is probably because she is but a mere child and she isn't often seen outside of Lord Horikawa's presence. But the storyteller describes that a few times he has seen her, that she looks worse for wear, looking honestly kind of miserable and not mentally well. The narrator himself, being a character in the story, did not act upon it at the time and simply went on with his day. But that changed in the next chapter, where in the middle of the night he is suddenly approached by Monkey Hide tugging on his clothes. The monkey drags him along, and the confused narrator eventually gets led along to the lodgings in which Yoshihide's daughter resides at. And there, right after he trips due to Monkey Hide tugging him along, is where he bumps into Yoshihide's daughter. The daughter was at the time running away from something, her clothes disheveled, teary-eyed, red cheeks, trembling and breathless. There were very clear signs of abuse, noting also from the narrator that he noticed she was running away from a figure, and so seeing that the daughter is not mentally well, he kept her company for a bit, but eventually figured that she had to go back to her room. This was because the narrator wasn't really anyone of status or authority in the household, and whoever she was running away from wouldn't want to see her gone for too long. At which point she went back, and Monkey Hide bowed to the narrator as if to thank him. A few days later, Yoshihide meets with Lord Horikawa to tell him to SYBAU, or as a normal person would say it, surf your best automobile up. That is to say, Yoshihide had to ask Horikawa a large favor and burn his carriage for the sake of the Hellscreen. You see, in the beginning of the book, the Hellscreen is described as a horrible and horrendous vision of hell, where the guardians of hell sit on one side, the tortured sinners of hell on another, but in the very middle of the painting, the focal point of it all, is a falling carriage carrying an innocent woman, falling down from the sky up above into the searing hell as it is engulfed in flames. And since Yoshihide cannot draw what he hasn't seen, he needs to ask not only Lord Horikawa to set one of his carriages on fire, but to also sacrifice a woman alongside it. And Lord Horikawa's reaction is one of my favorite paragraphs of text in the entire book, as he basically tells Yoshihide to KYS, or in other words, kill yourself. Or in other words, he tells Yoshihide to keep yapping sis, as he was thoroughly amused by the idea, to the point where the narrator wonders if Lord Horikawa has become as insane as Yoshihide himself. Lord Horikawa later suggested that the carriage burning will be held soon, in front of the gates of the Palace for Melting Snow, an estate that used to be owned by Lord Horikawa's sister before she passed away. And this, one moment in particular, is what sets the scene for the single most gruesome scene in the book. The entire rest of the book is dedicated to the days leading up to the carriage burning. The atmosphere in the manor grows grim and stern as everyone is preparing for the day of the burning. Pretty much everyone understands how significant this event is to not only Horikawa, but Yoshihide as well. The day would soon come, and by night everyone would gather in front of the abandoned palace of Lord Horikawa's sister. There, everyone from the servants all the way up to Lord Horikawa himself would be present for the event, as a carriage on a pedestal would be set up in front of the front gates. As the clock would strike midnight, the event would commence, and Lord Horikawa speaks up, saying my favorite line of dialogue in the entire book. And it is then when the carriage blinds will be flipped up and it will be unveiled who was actually inside the carriage. And immediately upon everyone casting their gaze upon the chained-up woman, no one could deny what they saw. It was unmistakable even, as the beauty and frailty of the woman could belong to no one else other than Yoshihide's own daughter. And it is this point to where an armed guard would threaten Yoshihide, keeping a blade at his neck as they forced him to watch. Yoshihide grimaces in shock and terror as Lord Horikawa gives the order to burn the carriage, and flames begin to engulf it. Everyone could only watch in horror at the scene unfolding. Even the guard that was threatening Yoshihide could not dare to look away while Lord Horikawa cackled maniacally. It is then when a figure appeared on top of the palace and leaped into the fire, and this figure was none other than Monkey Yoshihide, jumping into the fire to protect the daughter, but ultimately ending in futility as he died alongside Yoshihide's daughter, holding her tightly in her arms as he screamed and succumbed to the flames as well. At this point, Yoshihide started to laugh maniacally as well, probably having been driven mad by the horror deal too. And Yoshihide being Yoshihide, he could never forget what he saw. And so, in an act which could only be described as an ironic twist of fate and retribution for his karma, he would finish the Hellscreen a couple of days later, and shortly after presenting the work to Lord Horikawa, he would take his own life. Well, anyway, now that we're done talking about the book and traumatizing the hell out of you by depicting a father watching his daughter die in a gruesome fire in graphic detail, what does this actually tell us about Limbus Company, Yoshihide? Or I should say, Ryoshu? Well, I'll tell you what this definitely tells you, however. To like and subscribe, of course. Or maybe even becoming a channel member. Videos like this that talk about book counterparts and literary references are very few. Like, seriously, in a community that is already known to be illiterate, people who read are very rare. And not to mention people like me who go through the effort of fully reading them, analyzing them, theory crafting, and making it all into a video like me is... well, it takes a lot of effort, and it's very tiring. There's a reason this is coming out right before Canto 9 after all. And while Hellscreen is literally one of the shortest books in terms of Sinner source materials, sometimes I have to go through the effort of reading 2500 pages, like for my favorite Sinner's book, The Remote Red Chamber. So supporting the channel in whichever way you can goes an extremely long way to keep these kinds of videos going, and I would really appreciate it. But anyway, I've said enough. Let's get back to the point. Where was I again? Oh right, burn victims. So yeah, ever wondered why Ryoshu has a 4-match flame ego? You know, an ego all about the burning girl? Well, if you didn't skip the book section of the video, now you would know. Though, that isn't the only thematic Ryoshu has. As, if you're familiar with the theory crafting side of the fandom, or are really perceptive, you would know that there are 3 other thematics present in Ryoshu's identities and egos. Those being motherhood, protecting, and the pursuance of art. Now, motherhood is one of the more obvious of the 3. Like gosh, I wonder if the sinner who has a daughter may be a mother. But have you ever noticed how in a lot of Ryoshu's identities, she often tends to be the right-hand woman or servant of someone else? Taiyu Ryoshu is literally based off of a servant bodyguard in story. Heisho Ryoshu is also a servant, this time under Lord Honglu. Maid Ryoshu is literally a maid. Yorutifia Ryoshu is the right-hand woman of Yorutifia Honglu, which is actually kind of funny that she has 2 identities that serve Honglu, and even the case could be made for Kurukumo Ryoshu, as she is a Wakashu under an important advisor. As for the thematics of motherhood, well, I mean, she literally has 3 whole pieces of content that relate to Spider-Butt, an abnormality that is very much so known for associating itself with the concept of motherhood and being very protective of its children. Like gosh, I wonder if anyone has noticed these very hidden thematics about Ryoshu. But lastly, there's the pursuit of art, which can be seen in almost every other identity or ego, each one of them pursuing it in their own different ways, often having whole different flavors of that art that Ryoshu pursues. So, we now know a few things about Ryoshu. First of all, she really likes art. Second of all, she is very protective or serves under someone else frequently. And lastly, someone was apparently crazy enough to put a baby in her. This doesn't tell us much, now does it? However, if you watch the section of the video covering the book, I would like to shed a light on one of the very core character traits that both Yoshihide and Ryoshu both share, and that is their need to perceive art and study it closely. Remember how the book explicitly states that Yoshihide cannot draw what he hasn't seen before, and that's why he does the weird cruel things he does to replicate it? I think that Ryoshu has the exact same mentality, and even more actually. The reason I believe this is because Ryoshu exudes behavior that aligns with her literary counterpart. Heck, even in the beginning of the game we can see her studiously observing how Mephistopheles mutilates bodies to generate energy. In other identities like W Corp and Pierce Bistro, she has a very much so hands-on experience with creating and shaping art herself even, and uses it to inspire herself. Heck, even on multiple occasions in the story, Ryoshu will go out of her way to make a bad situation even worse, or act on her own whims just for the sake of making it more exciting or inspiring her. Like that one time where Ryoshu knocked down a whole chandelier for seemingly no reason, or that time where during the time-killing time investigations, Ryoshu simply had to go out of her way to ask a victim how it feels to have their time stolen. And hey, remember this guy? Yeah, neither do I. But Ryoshu knew this guy was gonna backstab the group from the second they appeared, but simply let them try out their plan, all for the sake of wanting to see if he'll be creative in the way he backstabs the sinners, and promptly cut off his hands when she wasn't satisfied. And that's another thing I feel a lot of people don't often talk about. Ryoshu is weirdly perceptive. Not only when it comes to emotional perception and being able to effortlessly take care of a kid in a spring cultivation event, she consistently knows something is about to go down before anything even happens. Like, go on, read for yourself as a showcase on the screen the numerous times she was able to predict an attack before it even happened. Though, speaking of things that can't even be noticed, I think there's one thing that I haven't talked about with Ryoshu yet, that almost no one in the community has noticed. And that is just how much he values memories. I wouldn't even blame anyone for not noticing it, because there are only just about 5 hints to this in the entire game. Remember how back in Canto 4, when the sinners just defeated Dongrang and had to have their memories partially wiped because they saw the K-Corp singularity? Well, Ryoshu had a surprisingly hostile reaction to having her memories tampered with, even outright threatening Alfonso, a Wing CEO, need I remind you, to not FUCK with her. Or in other words, f up current knowledge. And you might not know this, but Ryoshu is someone who is really smart and knows her boundaries. As inferred from how she reacted to really tough opponents, she and the rest couldn't possibly take on like Ricardo or Lei Heng. So she should know what it means to threaten a CEO of an entire wing and the consequences of it. So memories must mean a lot to her if she's willing to deal with the consequences of this kind of action, rather than just having a few hours or so removed from her memory. But that's just one of the 5 hints that memories mean a lot to her, because way later in Canto 8, Lei Heng has a line of dialogue that heavily implies that he knows Ryoshu had her memories wiped. This may seem like a throwaway line just to threaten Ryoshu with and showcase their history together, but the word choice is really peculiar. This is not a student and a mentor meeting up again and talking about the good old times, but Lei Heng specifically mocking her for having forgotten the good old times. And speaking of Lei Heng, this nicely segues into the next hint I want to talk about, which is the special buff Ryoshu gets when fighting Lei Heng, that buff being mutilated memory. And I want you to pay extra attention to the fact that it specifically describes the sound effect as mutilated, as that will be very important for the final theory crafting section and for the 4th hint. This is gonna go into 2 of the IDs a bit more thoroughly, but in Ryoshu's Contempt ID, she has a passive that is supposed to mirror Xiaohan's passive, that being my little brother's hand I let slip. However, instead of Ryoshu's passive reflecting as something like my daughter's hand I let slip, it is instead portrayed like this. Isn't it really interesting that this not only has to do with lost memories, but also that the way it's portrayed looks like a jumbled up mess in terms of censoring? And this is different from the censoring that happens when Dante suddenly has a crash out or when Heathcliff talks about that Cathy person, as they appear as boxes in text. This, however, appears as a jumbled up mess, almost as if it was mutilated into something completely incomprehensible, or as a normal person would call it. And then we have the last hint, which is one of the most integral ones and is one of the biggest indicators of what we can expect in Canto 9. That being these few lines from Heiju Ryoshu talking about a previous lord she used to work under and recording her memories. And this is one of the biggest breadcrumbs we're gonna get before Canto 9, as I think this one puzzle piece clues us in on what could potentially happen in there. Well, my dear viewer, you don't have to answer that for yourself because I'm about to answer it for you. After all, that's what this video is for. And given how accurate I was with my previous video, I am rather confident that I can be incredibly accurate again. Which, by the way, I want to just take pride in. I predicted so many things in my Hongnu video that ended up being true. Like Hongnu's arc where he deals with nihilism, the entire hierarchy evaluation bar, the thematics. I even predicted that the Jade Kalin was gonna show up, if it wasn't for the fact that Pojamoon cut a line of text from Lei Heng outright confirming Shashu is a color fixer.
그러면 네가 옷길이냐구만.
You can't tell me otherwise, this guy is literally just a color fixer. And I predicted it, and predicted that he will be the cause of the downfall of Hong Yuan. Oh yeah, also I'm predicting he will appear again and will then actually be revealed as the Shade Kalin. The line of dialogue from Lei Heng was presumably cut to make the reveal later, as I believe he is most likely gonna appear in Canto 9 and Canto 9 will take place in Q-Corp, as it is highly implied that that is where Limbus company is going next, with it being revealed that Q-Corp is inspired by Japan and that this is where Shashiyu is heading next. And Anyway, sorry for that long-winded rant. I really just wanted to choke my own ego for how accurate I was in the whole glue video. To not only show the community that I possess the gift of prophecy from Apollo, but to also make my claims seem more credible. Anyway, yes, very obvious guesses aside, Xiaxiu or Kongxiu will appear in Canto 9. And I want to get other obvious guesses out of the way too before getting to some more of the interesting and meaningful things. Like another obvious guess is that all the other fingers will be present too, seeing as in Ryoshu's base ego art you can see all the fingers present in the art. Also, I predict in Canto 9 we will get the scene of light ability associated with Gebra. This is not only because we've been going in reverse order of the library floors, but also because Gebra and the Courage to Protect heavily link back to Ryoshu. And lastly, the Odashi that Ryoshu has is going to be pulled out. It would be genuinely mind-boggling if after all this build-up, that she doesn't pull out her sheathed sword. Now that the obvious stuff is out of the way, let's get to the real meat of the theory crafting section. What is Canto 9 going to be about and what is going to be in it? Like I said, we will be traveling to Q Corp and we will definitely meet all the figures there. But the big question is why they are all there and what kind of stake do they have in Ryoshu and her daughter. It is very much so highly implied that Ryoshu and every single finger have some sort of history together, as she knew Lei Heng, knows of the inner structure of the ring, is aware of just how dangerous the middle is, and knows of the pinky. The only one that was never mentioned by her and we have no knowledge of is the index. But in one way or another, all of them have a stake in Ryoshu and the reason that Ryoshu's daughter is being kept at the House of Spiders. Well, my personal theory is that the House of Spiders is either a replacement for the Horikawa matter in the book, or another important matter in another of Ryonosuke Akutagawa's books, that being the Spider's Thread. Yup, I've done it again. We're somehow done with the book section, but I've somehow wormed in another opportunity to talk about books. Truly goes to show that I'm the only Pokemon fan who actually reads. But anyway, I'm gonna keep this short and under a minute, so bear with me here. The Spider's Thread follows the story of Kanata, a bandit who recently died and got sent to hell. It is a short story that depicts Kanata trying to escape from hell after having been given an opportunity to get out of hell and ascend to heaven, as a long spider thread from the sky up above acts as a rope which Kanata can use to go to heaven with. He makes it about halfway through the spider's thread before looking down below him and noticing that all the other sinners of hell are climbing up the thread with him. To this, Kanata proceeds to yell out to the sinners in anger to proclaim that this thread is for him and him only, to which in a twist of karma and irony the thread snaps, almost as if punishing Kanata for his selfishness. The reason why the thread was provided to him in the first place, and pay close attention to this because this is a direct reference to Red Eyes Impenitent's Ryoshu. Apparently Kanata, in spite of the many sins he had committed in his living life, was given this thread to climb because he once did a single good deed in his life. You see, Kanata was once walking through a forest when he saw a small spider on the road. He thought about crushing the little thing, but before committing to the act he thought to himself a bit and ultimately decided it wasn't worth it, and instead brought the little spider to the opposite side of the road to which he was traveling. Anyway, the short story begins and ends with a certain figure watching all of this happen in hell from the sidelines, that person being Lord Shakyamuni, who resides in a place called the Lotus Spot of Paradise in Hell. He watches the entire event of Kanata being sent to Hell, climbing the spider's thread and eventually falling back down to Hell all unfold. And he doesn't even do anything himself. He just watches it and afterwards thinks, man, what an average Tuesday in Hell. Anyway, this long-winded explanation was to give a fun fact about Penitent's Ryoshu and to also explain the name of the season. But all this is to say that the House of Spiders may either be Lord Horikawa's matter or Lotus Spot of Paradise from the book. Anyway, I'm predicting that Ryoshu might have at one point worked for the House of Spiders, and that Lord Horikawa, maybe even Lord Shakyamuni, will be a character in the story. The reason why I think both might be included is because the original name of the House of Spiders was previously the Spider's House, before later being changed by Project Moon. This name change highly implies that there isn't just one quote-unquote spider in there, but multiple, and that makes me believe we might see both of these characters in there. And Ryoshu must have at one point worked for the House of Spiders to make the Hellscreen or pursue a more violent kind of art. Ryoshu pursued art for a long time and was implied by Lei Heng to have many different mentors. On top of that, she takes every possible opportunity she gets to make a situation have a more interesting twist or deeply study the different kinds of new art she could come up with or study from others. I think that is a big part of the reason why she is with Limbus Company in the first place, for all the different kinds of inspiration for her art she can find there. She needs to witness all kinds of different art to eventually make her masterpiece, whether that'll be the Hellscreen or something else. No, actually, she doesn't have to eventually make it. She needs to make it, because her daughter's very life depends on it. I think that Much like the book counterpart, the life of Ryoshu's daughter is being threatened, and Lord Horikawa and Shakyamuni have put Ryoshu in such a precarious situation to blackmail her to make the Hellscreen. And in a desperate attempt to find enough inspiration to make the Hellscreen, she sought out or was sought out by Limbus Company with the promise of being able to see enough suffering to depict the hell of searing heat in all of its twisted glory. That is what I feel like is almost guaranteed to happen in my biggest theory, but I also have many other smaller theories. For example, I could very well imagine Project Moon incorporating the spider's threat a lot more closely, like perhaps Ryoshu was a simple backstreets rat or abandoned shoutout in the backstreets, and one day, much like a Dota, she was offered a small threat from the House of Spiders, promising she could have a life and be redeemed if she followed her teachings and became an artist. This would explain her mannerisms and why she's so obsessed with art, since I can't imagine any other way as to why she would have developed that way. And no, I know what you're thinking, what about the ring? Maybe they taught her. Well, that is very much so disproven by the fact that Ryoshu thinks the ring's form of art is ridiculous and she antagonizes them. And heck, growing up as an average backstreets kid but having a massive glow up could also fit Gebra's story, since they've made multiple different references to the red mist with Ryoshu. But then, how would one go about explaining her memory issues? I feel this too might be linked back to the House of Spiders, but actually is a lot more tied to the Odashi that Ryoshu has. You've probably seen it but never really thought about it. The Japanese idioms on Ryoshu's Odachi. These might actually provide an explanation as to Ryoshu's memory problems. You see, the text on the sheet of Ryoshu's Odachi is what is typically described as a Yoshi Zukugo, an idiom consisting of 4 kanji used to create an aesthetically and visually pleasing sentence. There's 3 of them on the sheet in fact, and please excuse my horrible pronunciation, but they are as follows. Mukamuchu, losing control of oneself. Abikyokan, to cry out in the midst of tragedy. Shiri Metsuretsu, which means all 3 things, incoherent, illogical, or nonsensical. And I believe that the true meaning of these 3 idioms are warnings for drawing the blade actually. And that Ryoshu had already drawn the blade once before. I think that these warnings either start from the top or the bottom, and are a vague indicator of the consequences of drawing the blade, with having her memories being mutilated being the first consequence she endured for drawing the blade. This can either be associated with losing control of oneself or incoherent, illogical, nonsensical, as I can see both idioms fitting for this kind of punishment. It is probably an incredibly powerful blade that can slice through targets really easily, as implied by Lei Heng's dialogue at the end of his fight, but there's a fair chance that there might actually be consequences for drawing the blade, as Ryoshu never unsheathes it, and it takes an extreme amount of willpower for Ryoshu to not immediately draw her blade on Lei Heng when she first saw him again. But that begs the question, what does happen if she draws the blade? Perhaps the second consequence, to cry out in the midst of tragedy, might mean her daughter's life would be in danger if she drew the sword again. And we would know what the third consequence could hold, as both of them could very well just imply that Ryoshu would distort, whether you start from the top or the bottom. Either way, I've saved the absolute biggest and most accurate prediction for last, and that is that Ryoshu's Canto will be P-E-A-K, and that this video has convinced you to LAS, or like and subscribe as some people call it. Anyway, this is all the munition I have as far as theories goes, because if I were to go further, 1, the video will be way too long, my deadline is already short as is. Sorry if it's been noticeable that this video is lower quality, because I am on a deadline of just a few weeks. And 2, the video will become completely nonsensical and I will become progressively less accurate. So I will be leaving it off here. I would do an ego prediction, but ever since Canto 8, the pattern to predict egos with has gone completely out the window as Project Moon decided to use a LobCorp ego as the big seasonal ego last season. So I'll be ending the video here. Remember to LAS, and I hope that this video will make you appreciate and enjoy Canto 9 even more. Until next time.